All right. Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode talking about women ordination, dealing with some of the texts that have been used to silence women, use dealing with some of those today. Um, and I have a priest from our diocese here, Mother Deborah Jackson, is with us. She is wonderful. She's a spiritual director. She's on staff at a church. She is highly administrative, keeps a lot of the stuff going within our world, keeps a lot of the things turning. And so, but also deeply wise, uh, very intentional about asking great questions. And I wanted to have her on to talk through some of these difficult texts because I know that she has asked very intentional, difficult questions about these. I don't even have to ask her to know that. So, Mother Deborah, thank you for joining us. Thank you for being willing to come on here and share about some of these things. Can
It
you
is
tell us
my
just a little bit
pleasure.
about, yeah, tell us a little bit about where you're from, your journey to being ordained, all of that fun stuff.
Sure. Coming to this question, I have the great benefit to come from a tradition in in the Pentecostal world where women have been ordained for decades. Um, and so growing up as a little girl in church, I saw women preach. I saw women in positions of leadership. Now, interestingly enough, not so much in the hierarchical structure of a denomination, but certainly welcome onto to the pulpit to be able to preach. So at the point that as a young girl, young woman, loving the Lord and taking maybe a little bit of a circuitous route to ordination, there wasn't the thought that that couldn't happen, because that's what I grew up seeing were women preachers.
Mm-hmm.
Sister Bly was a
Mm-hmm.
hero of mine, and you can imagine just with the name, because that was the time we still called them sisters,
Yeah.
brothers and sisters, right? And she
Yeah.
was a powerhouse woman who loved the Lord with every fiber of her being and could communicate his word and that love in ways that changed my life. So for me, there was an example that this could happen. It was a little off-putting as an adult to realize, oh, not everybody thinks this, not everybody
Yeah.
believes this. And isn't it interesting that one sentence in scripture is the basis for an entire philosophy on whether women can be ordained or not, regardless of what practice you read about in
Mm-hmm.
scripture. This one sentence is going to be where we hang our hat. Um,
Yeah, of course.
I am in the Nashville area serving on a church here and was ordained many years ago in the denomination that I served for many years. As I was drawn into a more liturgical practice and a sacramental way of worship, my heart longed for an ordination in that tradition. I went down a path for a good distance with a group that was willing to talk about women's ordination in this tradition, and got to a
Mm-hmm.
point that it then became very clear that now they didn't really even want to have the conversation. And
Mm-hmm.
that was my goal, was let's talk about this, until
Mm-hmm.
that door very, very firmly said, no, we don't even want to have a conversation. We know we're right. And so I was beyond thrilled and felt affirmed, really, when the diocese that we're part of came into the picture, and I realized that apart from my Pentecostal heritage and the value that that placed on women's voices, that there was a place in a more sacramental life that valued that as well. I think in functioning as a minister, that's been what I've done my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Whether somebody else affirmed it or not, that's the call
Mm-hmm.
of my heart. That's the purpose I think God has me here, is to help care for people's souls.
Absolutely.
To have that, and it's heartbreaking to think that there are so many human beings who love God and want to share that, and are told just because of the physical body you're in, you're you're not equipped.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of sense does that make?
Right.
If we look at scripture that says there's neither Jew nor Gentile, male or female,
The
right?
female. Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't somehow fit into the equation of I don't let women speak, as Paul said.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
how do you pick and choose that? If you're going to choose one, how do you choose? Unless there is some desire to keep in place and support a power dynamic
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
benefits one over the other.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too, like, I actually brought this up several times when I was talking with Dr. Kim about this, that Paul gives specific instructions to women for when they pray.
Or
Yeah.
prophesy.
Or prophesy.
Yeah,
And it's interesting how that we we really do pick and choose, like, and this is the point that I brought up with Dr. Kim, and I may just keep bringing this up and this being a theme throughout the recordings that I'm doing, but either Paul is contradicting Jesus. So Paul is saying Jesus was wrong in his liberation of women voices. Okay. Or Paul is not contradicting Jesus, which I believe is true. He's not contradicting Jesus, but he's saying something to a particular group of people in a context that makes it, like, that context makes the text say what it was meant to be saying. Um, and like, I mean, like, this is, Gordon Fee wrote the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. One of the things that he says is you can't take a text written in a particular context and bring it into your context and make it mean the same thing here, because it doesn't.
right.
And I hear lots of, like, arguments and pushbacks on that. Like, I've heard that for years, and one of the things is that I hear often is that, do we not submit to, like, if our culture is wrong, should we not be submitting to that culture? Well, this is not just like a cultural thing. This is not like a men were in men were more likely to preach, women couldn't learn, blah blah blah. That's not even a great contextual analysis of what was happening, like, whatsoever. In the text, that the two popular texts, which are First Corinthians chapter 2, verses about 8 through 15, and then First Corinthians 14, like 30, in the 30s, right there. So when you go to those two texts, and I'm sure that people who watch, who are land on either side of this, when you read those two texts, what how should we be thinking about these texts? just from a hermeneutical perspective and an exegetical perspective of what was being said in that time to those people. Why does Paul make reference back to the garden, Adam and Eve, all of those things? I think those are all questions that people ask, and sometimes, people try to like scurry around those things, but it's like, you don't have to. There's pretty clear, um when you do a contextual analysis in an exegetical process, something pretty clear is being said here for a particular reason. So,
Yeah.
can you talk to us about that?
Well, I think it's interesting too when you look at those two texts to keep in mind what else Paul has said about women. What he said about women who are serving as deacons, women who
Yes.
are apostles, women who have supported ministry, women who are teachers. So is he contradicting himself, even if he has
Yes.
affirmed these other women, affirmed their roles, called them deacons? Um, and then we have these particular sentences that is Paul contradicting himself in that? But in looking at who he was writing to, the time, the place, it's interesting that uh, I think it's the First Timothy one about remain quiet, to not have authority over,
Hmm.
looking at that. There still is the implication she's in the room to learn, and
Hmm.
that's not a normal thing, right? In their
Right.
context, he's making
Right.
allowance for women to be in the space where the teaching is going on,
Hmm.
but in a particular way. Um, and in having women in the space where teaching is going on, in the culture, any new student, any young student is expected to listen quietly while
Quiet.
the teacher is teaching, regardless of
Hmm.
gender. You're the young one in the learning environment, and so the
Hmm.
expectation is that you do that respectfully and quietly. And I don't know that
Hmm.
that's gender specific, because that's a
Yeah.
cultural.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think too, like one of the reasons that he addresses women specifically here is because there is a specific issue that Timothy is dealing with. And what we've done is we've looked at this issue and we've said, okay, we've taken this singular issue and now made it an entire global church issue,
Right.
when that's not what Paul is doing.
Yeah.
He's saying there are women coming into your church who want to teach. The path forward for them to teach is to learn quietly. What he is actually saying is the opposite of
Right.
what our culture has said, and he is saying, leave them alone. Let them learn in the quiet.
Making provision
And
for them to be in the space. Yeah.
yes, and I think it's interesting too, like the Artemis cult here that is there. And I made this was kind of something that I was seeing a few weeks ago, and I there was an author that I read recently that hints around at this, but he doesn't just outright say it. But I was thinking that Paul does make reference back to Adam and Eve.
Mhm.
And when he does that, I find it very interesting that the one thing that we see with Adam and Eve is that Adam ruling over Eve didn't work.
Exactly.
Adam ruling over Eve was that did not work. The way that God, I think, worked this from the beginning were for Adam and Eve to be priests together
Mhm.
in the world. And so when you see him make reference to this, I think what he is saying is number one, you have to give them space to learn. Like, don't try to rule over them, number one. And then number two, if they don't come in and have space to learn, if you don't make space for them to learn, you are going to get the result that you got with Eve. If you try to rule over them, they're going to say things in the church that are going to harm it more than if you were to just give way to them, because they're coming from a cult. They're coming from something that is false,
Right.
and they are to learn the way of Jesus so that they do not make the mistake that Eve makes and goes about doing this their own way. And so I'm not saying that that's a thought that I had while reading it off of a thought that someone else had shared.
Right.
And so how does that sit with you when you know kind of the contextual analysis of it, of that passage of scripture? How does it sit with you when that verse is taken to mean something that it just simply doesn't mean?
Yeah.
How does it sit with you?
What we see is, as we go back to the beginning, is both male and female charged with stewardship, with
Mhm.
being fruitful, with caring for creation. And the entirety of the rest of the story is when that didn't happen, how everything fell apart and continued to
Mm.
fall apart. So
Yes.
I think your point is well taken, that that didn't work. And we have all these
Mhm.
stories telling us how that didn't work. And the
Never
threads are
worked.
being woven back together as we follow Christ through this, woven back together so that men and women are in joint stewardship.
Yeah, it's new creation.
It's new creation. Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really good.
I think the
I
the making space for women in this place that Paul's advising Timothy, um, the making space is the men in the space we're learning as well.
Mhm.
It's not that women are coming into these churches where the men are well versed, right? Everybody's learning. So it's a new
Right.
dynamic for all of them.
Mhm. Mhm.
How
Yeah,
do we do
absolutely.
this? Yeah, how do we do this?
Mhm.
And Timothy, as a young man, here's here's how you can handle that. But you make
Yeah.
space for everybody to sit and
Yes.
learn.
Yes. Mhm. I think that's beautiful. That the verse that we have said for years, or not that we have said, but that has been a verse that has been used to not let women be hold positions of authority, not, you know, not let women be ordained. Those verses, like, with a good contextual analysis, I think they actually they come alive to us, and we realize that what Paul was saying to this church is not for all churches for all time. And, you know, some of the pushback that I get on that, like, I was recently at like a roundtable discussion, and we were actually this was kind of the subject of like women ordination.
Mhm.
And I thought it was interesting that one of the questions brought up was, if you do that with that text, what does that mean that you do with the other texts that are difficult? And I was like, you mean just like a contextual analysis? You do it with all of them. You do it with the whole Bible. Like,
Yeah,
and
the whole
so,
thing,
it,
each piece is
yeah,
written to a specific people in
yeah,
a specific place, in a specific time, in a specific context,
for a reason.
for a reason. Yeah.
These words mean something. And so I thought it was interesting how the hardest pushback that I got was from someone. What they pushed back on was a contextual analysis of the scripture.
Mm,
And so it was very telling that context didn't mean a lot to them. And the reason why context didn't mean a lot to them is because there is not scripture to use to weaponize against what they feel called to do.
yeah, yeah.
And it was very telling that when I just when I heard um
And ask the
that
question,
question be asked.
do you not study all scripture in context?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, right, right. So yeah. So tell me a little bit about, like, your journey towards um becoming a deacon
Mhm.
and then a priest. Tell me a little bit about that journey for you. Once you kind of, like, maybe you grew up in an environment where women ordination was normal,
Mhm.
women preaching was normal, but there had to be a time where someone presented these texts to you and they're like, what do you do with this?
Mhm.
Tell me, like, when you dealt with the First Corinthians text and the Second Timothy, or sorry, the First Timothy 2 text, and then how from that point, how you were like, okay, this makes perfect sense to me. I kind of know what was going on here.
Mhm.
And then tell me about your ordination as a deacon and your ordination as a priest. Like, I think both of those things, or all of the, just listening to those things, I think would be very helpful for people.
Isn't it isn't it interesting that you can come into a text with your lens so already in place that for me looking at that text, it was, this is a provision for women to learn, to be
Hmm.
in the room, to be in the room where it happens, right?
Hmm.
That's the lens I went into it with. And someone with the lens of, this is this is a text to affirm why women cannot teach, cannot preach, and don't even see that women are
Hmm.
in the room, are in the space that he's talking about.
Hmm.
I don't know how you get beyond that to start out with the lens that is so totally fixed that this is not women in the space. This is reasons why they can't teach, without recognizing he's got them in the space.
Yes, absolutely.
So to come into this to come into the reading with the perception of, oh, look, they're here. Women are
Hmm.
here in this space
Hmm.
where the teaching is going on. There's not some separation even at that point, but they're welcome into the space. So what is he saying about that? About how that works? And to
Hmm.
be honest, I had to get past maybe a couple of decades of thinking, well, you're just wrong in your interpretation, which
Yeah.
is, as bullheaded as the
Yeah.
opposite, that you're just
Yeah.
wrong. I know what God's called me to do. And, if you've got a
Yeah.
problem with you and he can take it up. I realize that's
Yeah.
not a real productive stance, but for a while
Sometimes
that
sometimes
was
it's the only
the only
one
way I
that's
would go.
available to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My journey into holy orders, into the diaconate and the priesthood, again, I am so grateful for the tradition in which I was raised, what it exposed me to in the sense of women preachers. But there was a lot that I was not exposed to, that I was an adult before I discovered some of the early mothers and fathers in the church and their writings. And um, when when I started reading some of that and thought, why did I not know this? Where have these people been all my life that I've grown up
Mm-hmm.
in church? And I had there was a writing by Catherine of Genoa that just slayed me. How did
Yeah.
I not know this woman even existed? So that kind of set me on the path of discovering a more liturgical, sacramental
Mm-hmm.
life and influence. And although I had been ordained denominationally and serving in a church, to embrace what felt to me like a deeper understanding and a greater fullness. And really, I've called it I've a home for my heart
Mm-hmm.
in a more sacramental way of life. And it is a way of life. It's not just what you do Sunday morning. It's the
Right.
disciplines and the practices that form you more deeply. And as a woman who feels called to help people see God for the care of their souls, there was a longing in me for an ordination, a recognition in this tradition that is giving me so much life, to be able to step fully into that with all of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And that was greeted with open arms and welcomed, and not half-heartedly, but as, well, of course, that's who you are, Deborah, a minister of the gospel. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's who we welcome you as. That was really, really important. And I didn't realize how important it was until hands were laid on me and the prayers were prayed, and it just felt like God smiled.
Yes. Yep. It's beautiful.
I don't really even have words for it, for the completeness of what I have to offer in service to him with
Mm-hmm.
this affirmation of ordination.
Yep. And it's so good.
And to think that there are, half the planet or so, there are women who feel that same way, who
Mm-hmm.
long to serve the God they love fully and dynamically, without reservation or restriction. And
Mm-hmm.
we don't make allowance for that, but keep in place the strictures and structures as they are, for a power imbalance.
Mm-hmm. How do you think that two-part question here? Number one, if there is a young woman who watches this who says, I feel the call of God on my life, what would you say to that person about pursuing the call of God on their life and ordination? And then number two, if there are pastors and leaders listening, how should we respond to women who come forward and say, I have a call of God on my life. I know this. I have known this.
Mhm.
How do we respond to them? Because I think in the tradition that I grew up in, any woman with a personality is just Jezebel,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
Any woman that is forward and has big opinions, well, they're just manipulative. And obviously that's not true.
right,
Like that's not true at all.
right.
But sometimes, like I think it's totally normal, especially in the churches that I come from, for a young man to come up and say, "I feel God's called me to the ministry."
Mhm,
But how do we even normalize when a young woman comes up and says, "Hey, I feel called to the ministry"?
mhm,
Because what I feel like sometimes happens is that it's almost like instead of celebrating this appropriately, we celebrate this in a way that says, look at what this young lady is willing to go through to be ordained through the back door and do
mhm,
something that God has called her to do.
mhm,
She's willing to submit in this way. The power dynamics come back into play here.
mhm.
How do you think that pastors can normalize that, promote it, normalize it, and not feel like that they have to ordain women through the back door?
Yeah. Have women on your staff. I know there
Okay.
are, I have, what immediately comes to mind are two families in our church who came up to me and said, "We're here because there's a woman pastor, and my daughter wanted to go to a church that had a woman on staff." If you believe
Beautiful.
it's important, then hire a woman on staff. Let her
Yeah.
be visible and not in a token way in the areas that you might say, well, women can serve there.
Right.
If you believe it, have them on staff. And whatever
Yeah.
the process of discernment is for a young man who comes forward to say, I feel a call, it's the same process of discernment for a young woman.
I love that. Hmm. I love what you said too, and I'll even say take it further than just putting them on staff. Like, do not put them in the role and call them a director if they are doing priestly and pastoral ministry.
Right, right,
Call them pastor.
right. If they are
That's
pastoring children, they are caring for the most precious thing in our church,
yeah,
caring for the spiritual growth and development. That's pastoring.
yeah.
Have
I
have
yeah.
the woman who is on staff also be part of the teaching team. Let that
Yeah.
voice be heard on Sunday mornings occasionally,
Mhm. Mhm.
whatever your rotation is. Just a regular part of the rotation.
It's very, it's very like sometimes I'm not meaning to like feel good about the things that you're saying or too good about it, but it's like, we have women on our staff. Okay. We have women pastors on staff. We call them Pastor Emily, Pastor Katie, now Pastor Becca. And it's like, that is what I want people to know is that if you are looking for a church that says women can be in ministry but they cannot be in a pastoral role, this is not the place for you. If you're looking for a church, like if this is a big deal to you, like if you're looking for a church that says we need women pastors, we got plenty of them.
Yeah. And
And
I would also say when you have a guest speaker come in, are those always men guests, or do you have women guest
it's good.
speakers as well?
Good.
If it's important to you, live it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the things that I actually just like I was thinking about that and that like I'm taking notes on some of the stuff that you're saying here because I think it's important. Um, to the young girl who would feel that there is the call of God on my life, what would you tell her if she's having that thing in the back of her mind of, I don't know if I can do this
Mm,
because this is a man's job, or I've been taught that this is a man's job.
yeah. She has to have somebody that she can talk to. You've got an excellent example there of the women on your staff. There's somebody she can talk to. If she doesn't see
Mhm,
that it's being done,
mhm.
then how will she ever stir up the gumption to do it if she doesn't
Yeah.
see it modeled?
Mhm.
So talk to somebody who's doing it, or somebody who wanted to do it and didn't, who maybe regrets that,
Yeah. Yeah.
who wanted so badly, and let let somebody help you, encourage you. Just talk about it. Have a space that
Mhm.
a girl can talk about wanting to be in ministry. I have
Yeah.
an 11-year-old here who is
Mhm.
confident she's called to ministry. And
Yeah.
on Sunday mornings, she helps me prepare communion. She is part
Beautiful.
of that service every Sunday in the back room, helping me get all of the elements together. She's with me when I pray over them. So for
Beautiful.
those younger girls who are feeling that call, find some way to involve them in the work of ministry now.
I love that. I think that's something that I don't think a lot of pastors think about doing. Like, I think it kinda flies over the top of our head. Like, how can we if there's someone that we know feels called to do this, how can we give them, age appropriate and emotionally, like, appropriate, spiritually appropriate things to do that will just be seeds in the ground of their heart
Yeah. It's
that
almost like in the old days, a child would become an apprentice. It's almost like bringing them along as an apprentice in appropriate ways. And the
Mhm,
conversations that you can have in those moments as they're serving with you in some capacity, those are life changing. You don't know it at the moment, but you're planting
mm,
something, reinforcing the work of the Lord in them in ways that will bear some fruit down the road.
mhm,
And that's it. We're just cooperating with what God is doing in those kids' lives, in those women's lives. We're just cooperating with what God's doing.
mhm. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Mm. How do you think that, um, in circles and I think this may be, like, for just hermeneutics at all,
Yeah.
when someone approaches you with a different interpretation, just say of the verses that we've talked about,
Mhm.
obviously that is we don't think that that's right. We don't think that their interpretation is right. But I know good-hearted, pure-hearted people who read those texts and are like, "I just don't see what you're seeing."
Mhm.
How can we, the world and those who will watch this, how can we advocate for women in ministry and stay kind and humble while doing it? Because in my experience, the more aggressive that you are about someone's way being wrong, the more they dig their heels in. What is a way that you've seen doors open because of just a gentleness and a lightness that someone has carried in their interpretation, in their contextual analysis, which we've already talked about of this. How should we do that? How should we go about that? Give us some wisdom there.
It's not an argument you win. You
Hmm.
can, you've seen it. You've probably engaged in some of those conversations.
Yeah.
You're not going to change somebody's mind with your argument. I love that you asked the question, how do we do this lovingly and gently and humbly? Walk what we believe without bludgeoning people with it, because that won't solve anything. And there's enough bludgeoning going on right now that if you don't engage in that, that makes you pretty different from what a lot of the experience
That's
is.
so good.
And maybe it's that gentleness and humility that opens the door to even having a conversation, not an argument, even a conversation.
One of my and this person, I mean, I would assume that he's gonna watch this. So I love him to death. One of the conversations that I got in about this, I know this person, me and him are very similar. We're both very stubborn,
Mhm.
and it's like that has worked against us in our lives, and we both openly admit that. We were talking about this, and I basically was just like, dude, you're wrong. Like, like I love this person, but I was like, dude, you were just wrong. And it got to the point where it was like in the conversation, and I'm sharing this as an example. In the conversation, I was like, you will not shut up long enough for me to tell you what this means.
Yeah, he didn't take that well.
And he didn't. He didn't. So I'm gonna give everyone like a piece of advice. Do not do it that way. Do
Mhm.
not say those things. And even though that we both are like that, so it was very quick for us to forgive and move on. In the next conversation that we had about this, we actually were having a conversation like around a table at like a church camp. And he was like, you said some stuff that is going to have to make me reconsider what I think about this.
Mm, mhm,
And the spirit was, number one, I did not have this conversation over the phone, and I was listening to his questions very intently. I weren't I was not assuming that these questions weren't going to be good questions
mhm.
and that ones that I had already thought about.
Yeah.
But I was listening to these questions and then responding the best that I knew how. And sometimes it's okay to say, this is a conversation where we are exploring what this could possibly mean.
Mhm.
And go ahead in the front and say, and sometimes this doesn't help solve anything, but go ahead in the front and say, there used to be a teacher at a school or at a at a ministry school, not a Bible college, but a ministry school that
Mhm.
would say this term that I'm about to say. He would use this term, heretical whimsing. Like, this could be totally wrong, but what if?
Yeah.
What if this text means this? And I threw that out there, and what it did was is it took down everyone's defenses of, I have to come to this table to be right, because none of us are there to be right. We're there to talk.
Yeah.
And so,
And to have a conversation implies listening well, implies
mhm,
having a curiosity about what the other person has to say, rather than using whatever it is they say just as the jumping off point for your point, right? But a curiosity in what does he or she hear when they read this?
mhm,
I wonder what lens they have on their spectacles as they open the book to begin with. I wonder I wonder what the predisposition is as they
Mm-hmm.
as they read this text. I wonder what they've heard all their life that's
Mm-hmm.
so absorbed into them that they don't even realize that it's not their understanding, but the fourth grade teacher that they had, right? To be curious about somebody else's process and really listen. That's going to lead you to some really good questions and maybe even open a door to say, that's what Paul said here. What about how he talked about Priscilla? What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To go to those
Mm-hmm.
other places where women are affirmed and just written about matter of factly in as serving.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're asking questions, and this is my spiritual director hat on, asking questions opens the door to understanding and maybe the place that that person feels respected enough and
Mm-hmm.
safe enough to let you speak into their life. But you have to
Mm-hmm.
earn that. And you earn it by being curious and humble and listening really, really well, because there's always a subtext going on, whatever they're underneath, whatever they're saying. So, what's going on underneath that? Maybe if you listen closely enough, you'll get a hint about it, and the conversation can go someplace that you never would have expected. But it's not because you have your talking points and you're ready to rip them off and, bat it
Yeah.
out of the field, but that you're receptive to listening to what that person's heart is saying and
Mm-hmm.
joining them there and open the word in gentleness and humility and have the conversation at that point.
I love that. I think that's very helpful. And to tag along like what you said, like what do they bring to the text with them? Like that's such an important question to ask when someone has a different perspective than
Mhm.
you about any sort of scripture. Um, one of the one of the people that I have over time, me and him have talked through the women in ministry discussion, and he has changed his position. And he not that I'm like out here trying to like I don't just walk around with a poster or a t-shirt on. It's like if you don't believe in women in ministry, come talk to me. But I have had several of these conversations.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that he admitted to me one time, and I thought this was very interesting, that he always read Paul's words about women, specifically those, through the lens of how he was treated by women in positions of power in his life. And one of the things is that he was abused
Mhm.
and he was abused by women. And so where he was is Paul foresaw this happening
Mhm.
and he knew that all of this stuff
Yeah.
that women would do this and women would do this, but we know that abuse is most certainly not uniquely tied to women.
Right. Right.
Like,
Well, and
have
none
you
of
have
us
you looked
come
at
to,
Christian news in the past year?
yeah,
you know
yeah. None of us come to scripture as a blank slate. We bring all of our
Mhm.
experience and all of our prejudice and all of our wounds into this experience of reading scripture. And so it will be a lens through which we view and understand.
I think that's such a beautiful, just such a beautiful. It's a nugget of wisdom that you can use as a tool,
Mhm.
and I just love that. I
Well, and it
love
means
that.
that you can't fault somebody for bringing their experience of being abused into their reading of scripture. But you're not going to know
Hmm.
about that unless you ask some good questions and listen well to them.
And you actually become a safe person for them to hold a different idea than you, and
Yeah.
they over time they open up. That's one of the things that I think is important, because conversations like this, I was actually having a conversation with my therapist about conversations that kind of fall in this category.
Yeah.
And she made this statement, and like it will be one that I kind of carry with me, that conversations like this are holy ground. They are liberating in ways that we don't yet see.
Mhm.
And when she said that, I was just like, it's beautiful. Like it made me feel like that having some of these conversations like is worth every time I jump on a Zoom call, every time I read a book, like it's worth it. I am standing on holy ground. We are standing on holy ground.
Absolutely.
And I thought another thing that she made mention of was when we have these conversations with the right spirit. She's former Pentecostal. I'm not sure all the dynamics of her spirituality now, but the people that she likes, I bet she's going to the table every week. um, I would make a bet. I would make a
Yeah.
bet.
Yeah.
It seems to be some liturgical sacramental, because she used this language one time, or I said, I asked this question, or I made this statement. I was like, would you say that some of these conversations, like God's uniquely present here in a way that maybe you don't sense him in other places?
Mhm.
And she was like, yeah, I would say that. And I was like, the way that maybe Bishop Ed would talk about these conversations is these are sacramental. They're not sacraments, but they are sacramental conversations. And so, man, you have provided us with a lot of wisdom. And I think, if I were going to ask you anything else, I would ask this: How can we, how can we have conversations about this without it feeling like that you are having to advocate like for yourself? How can we have conversations where we come into the conversation where you don't feel like that you're having to like women are not having to fight to prove themselves,
Mhm.
like especially around these texts, and especially like in ordination services, stuff like that? How can we come to these conversations without it feeling like we're trying to make you make a point or fight for something?
I think to come into a conversation really believing that God calls all of us, that your starting point is God calls all of us. And there will be different interpretations of what that call looks like. I understand that, but to even get to that point in the conversation, that the call of God on our hearts is equal, male and female. I don't know, there's a respect implied in that there is neither male nor female.
Yeah, particularly in new creation.
And particularly in, yeah, yeah.
And I love that, because we even see how when Paul writes those words, there's no Jew or Greek, no male or female. What it's not doing is eliminating the uniqueness of those. What it is saying is that we deserve equal respect despite our differences. And I think one of the things that we may lose, and sometimes this becomes culture, this really does become cultural. We impose our cultural norms onto men and women.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, most more times than not, it is in favor of one and not in favor of the other.
Right.
It depends on the subject. But even this last week, like I was having a conversation with someone and they were like, men are not they're not emotional. And I'm like, that's not true.
Well, of course they
Like,
are. Yeah.
yeah, I'm like, that's not true at all.
Yeah.
Like men are very emotional. Like they just don't know they don't know how to express it because we have been told that when you express emotion, that means that you are weak or whatever. And I'm like, men most certainly have emotions.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Part of being human. And how sad that that very fundamental aspect of humanity has been crushed.
crushed. Yeah, great word. Mhm.
Mm.
Well, Mother Deborah, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for jumping on and talking about these texts with us and maybe some of the things that we can see when we go to them. I think it's fantastic that you grew up inside of a denomination in a world where this was very normal. And it's interesting how when that is normal in your world, when the first time that you went to these texts, it was, oh, I know exactly what he's doing. He's making space for them. That's all he's doing.
Yeah.
Versus someone like me who did not grow up in church at all. And there was always this stigma, even in the denomination that I started following Jesus in. There was this stigma around them, women in ministry, but they believed in it.
Mhm.
Like it was like, we believe in it, but not totally.
But we're just not going to.
Um, yeah, yeah, we believe it, but it's like when you say that you believe in like baptism, but you just never have baptism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
um, so anyways, I think it's interesting how the environment that I became a Christian in and started thinking about ordination, women preaching. I believe women could preach because of like Mary,
Mhm.
but when I started reading Paul, I was like, okay, I don't know what this is saying. And the reason that I didn't know what it was saying is because I was in an environment that was just a bit confusing.
Yeah.
And so that text was confusing to me.
Sure. Sure.
Um, and so I loved how you pointed that out. And I loved the stuff that you said about what pastors can be doing, how we can go to conversations. This has just been super helpful for me in general. And I know that this is going to help anyone who watches. And so thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, it was just a joy. I'm grateful for the invitation, and I'm glad you're doing this, that you're making these conversations available to people.
Yeah,
Terrific.
I think it's important. I think, when people come to the table to try to learn, um, sometimes the conversations are real raw, they're very candid, and I like the learning process being fleshed out kind of before people because we
Mhm.
had an idea what we were coming to talk about,
Mhm.
but like, you know, it wasn't, it was very natural and organic. And so maybe this even gives people a way to say, oh, this is how you have a conversation about this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. A really good phrase is, I wonder. I wonder how
yeah.
you see this. I
Hmm.
wonder, I wonder what you feel when you read this. I
Hmm.
wonder to go into those conversations wondering.
Mm, that's beautiful. Well, all right, we are going to wind this down. If you're watching, thank you so much for watching. Um, you need to get yourself familiar with the work that Mother Deborah does in spiritual direction and the work that she does as a priest. And you will begin to appreciate all of the things that she has said with with way more depth at that point. And so thank you again,
You're
Mother
very
Deborah,
kind,
and
my friend. Thank you.
we will see you